Welcome, everyone. It's exciting to be here today to hear from so many of you working on pressing issues related to young people's reading learning. My name is Hilary Persky. I work at Educational Testing Service on item design and development for the National Assessment of Educational Progress. I work with ETS and NCS colleagues on the NAEP reading assessment. Many of the issues being discussed at this conference are important for that work. I have the pleasure of not just introducing one of the speakers for today, but also of working with her in her capacity as a member of the expert committee that vets and evaluates all of our reading assessment content for NAEP. Before I introduce Alison, I want to let you know that I'll be moderating a Q&A session after her presentation live, and we'll take your questions from the chat space. So if you'd be good enough to please type your questions in the chat, that would be terrific. Thank you. So without further ado, Alison Bailey is Professor and Division Head of Human Development and Psychology at the Department of Education, University of California, Los Angeles. As a developmental psycholinguist, Alison's expertise includes developing language learning progressions with multilingual and English learners and supporting teachers' academic language pedagogy and assessment practices. Alison is published widely in her areas of expertise. Her latest book is Progressing Students' Language Day by Day, and she is currently a principal investigator of 2 U.S. Department of Education funded projects focused on teacher professional learning with English learners. Alison, as I noted, is a member of the NAEP Reading Standing Committee. She is also a co-author of the National Academy of Sciences STEM and English Learners Report, and she serves on several state and other assessment technical advisory committees. Her presentation today is called Support for the Reading Development of English Learners, Formative Assessment and Oral Language Approaches. Her presentation, like this introduction, is pre-recorded, but again, we will join you live for Q&A at the conclusion of Alison's presentation. Now we'll hear from Alison.
Good afternoon, and thank you for the invitation to present this session on supporting the reading development of English learners, formative assessment, and oral language approaches. As you've likely heard from previous sessions during the summit, NAEP reading achievement has been stagnant for students overall for the past few years, hovering at around 35% of students at the NAEP proficient level since 2007, with the vast majority of students at the basic achievement level. I will begin by setting the broader context and how students have been performing in recent years on the NAEP reading portion when they are new speakers of English or English language learners. This will be in comparison with the NAEP trends for students who are designated as either former English learners or in other words, never English learners. For comparison's sake, I will refer to the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, or OECD, their Program for International Student Achievement, known as the PISA. That provides us with information about student performances internationally. I think you'll find the replication of the possible linguistic gap in reading achievement quite striking. Next, we can ask, how might we help to change the NAEP reading trends for students who are learning English as a new language? For this second part of the presentation, I'll focus on the integration of 2 strategies that can assist educators in their support of students' reading development. I'm going to briefly introduce and position formative assessment use with regards to large-scale assessment and its strengths with culturally and linguistically diverse students. Then I'll shift to a pedagogical strategy that leverages oral dialogue between teachers and students and between 2 or more students to support the formative assessment of reading abilities by helping to discern where students are in their learning. And then finally, we'll get a chance to watch together video excerpts to witness how teachers are doing this work as part of a community of practice to improve instructional experiences of culturally and linguistically diverse students. So first, the broader assessment context for recent reading performances. Let's look at recent NAEP performances from the perspective of English proficiency. The 2019 test items measured comprehension of text and ability to apply vocabulary knowledge, still based on the older 2009 reading framework, not the new framework released in 2019. So reading is defined the same way in both 2017 and 2019 assessments here. What we see are the average reading scores for each of the three groups at fourth grade. Students who are designated as English learners, EL, former English learners, and students who've never been designated English learners or non-EL. There's been a significant increase in EL performance, 2 scale points, since 2017, from 189 to 191. However, there is a large difference between the EL and both the former EL and non-EL groups, more than 30 scale points differences in those 2 years. Interestingly, the former EL group is doing best, and I'll say more about that in a moment. What these numbers translate into is that more than 65% of students in the EL group are below basic. And for reference, the NAEP basic achievement level is defined as partial mastery of fundamental knowledge and skills, namely the ability to identify elements of meaning and form and relate them to the overall meaning of the text, making inferences, develop interpretations, make connections between texts and draw conclusions, provide some support for analyses, and interpret the meaning of a word as it is used in the text, all en route to more sophisticated skills in these areas to be proficient or even advanced on NAEP reading. But the vast majority of students designated as English learners are not reaching this basic achievement level for reading. Turning to 8th and 12th grade quickly, for those interested in middle and high school students, we see the gap between EL and non-EL students widens between the grades, so that by 12th grade, those average scores translate into nearly 80% of English learners performing below basic. It's important to include an understanding of the former EL group performance. EL students exit the group when they are successful, so simple direct comparisons between EL and non-EL groups may not be that meaningful, but at least year-on-year comparisons within each group are important to understanding continued growth, for comparable size of growth, and grade level impacts. There's some evidence that the former EL group does better than the non-EL group on state annual summative ELA assessments, again, particularly in the elementary grades. But this may be an artifact of using a minimum threshold on state ELA assessments by some states and districts for reclassification to fluent English proficient for that former EL group. And in fact, the two groups are closely comparable at 8th grade, but lose ground at 12th grade, which may suggest continued more frequent monitoring to offer language and literacy supports after reclassification. And here are the promised OECD PISA results for reading. PISA measures what the organization calls reading literacy, that is comprehension of extended texts, both print and electronic, for 15-year-olds. By the way, digital sources for text are also now mentioned as possible test stimuli materials in the 2019 NAEP framework, so that will be coming up. Now, this is not quite the same designation as being a proficient speaker or not in the language of school in each of the countries, in the same way that we've seen English learner, former English learner, and non-English learner used in the NAEP data. Here we have whether a 15-year-old student's reading comprehension is tested in the language they speak at home most of the time, that's in the right column, or not, which is the middle column. That middle column is the closest we come to the language learner designation. But of course, a student with this designation in the PISA data may be bilingual and thus proficient in the language of the reading test, even if it's not the language that they most often use at home. So these numbers may actually be an underestimation of the scores of students who are still acquiring the test language, because the group will likely include fluent bilingual students as well. It is revealing, however, the adverse effects on just a mismatch between test language and home language. And we can look at the US separately for the PISA reading and see a replication of the NAEP pattern although the gap between the two groups appears to be closing in the 3 years between administrations, although the increases that you see there in the test scores didn't meet the threshold for statistical significance for either group. And in case you're wondering if this is a phenomenon of the US educational context, the PISA data can give us an international understanding of the linguistic mismatch between test language and home language. Looking at the OEC countries overall, the slight decrease between years within the groups is not significant, but the difference between the two groups of students is large, averaging over 50 scale points and significant for both years, making the most recent US results in terms of performance and size of gaps look a little more positive, relatively speaking. And perhaps most striking, looking at the highest scoring countries on the PISA, countries the US students' academic performances are often compared with, and often unfavorably, we see that these countries do not do well by their students who are taking the PISA reading in a language which is not the language they use most often at home. So why are we taking the time to share all these tables and comparisons? Are culturally and linguistically diverse students the world over experiencing an academic achievement gap? Well, they could be. They may genuinely have less opportunity to learn academic content in classrooms that pull them out for specialized instruction in the dominant language of their societies. Or if they remain in general education classrooms, the content instruction they may receive may not be readily accessible. Or students may very well know the content, but they could be experiencing a linguistic gap in the midst of the assessment process itself. Even though NAEP does have some accommodations for English learners, predominantly Spanish-speaking students, the PISA only has a limited number of accommodations for students with disabilities. To be clear, the notion of a gap should not put the onus on students or take a deficit perspective of students. Rather, some portion of the academic achievement gap may not be due to a lack of content knowledge, but to the content assessment's inability to accurately measure student knowledge when a new language learning is still ongoing. The NAEP and PISA results I just shared may fall considerably short in revealing how well culturally and linguistically diverse students are actually reading. The question is, how can we make student performances on large-scale assessment more meaningful, more equitable, that is representative of students' reading abilities? And a second question is, what can we be doing in the interim to understand where students are in their reading development so that we can best assist their learning? I'm going to argue that the answer, in part, to both these questions is the same: formative assessment practices. So now for strategies. We know students can readily transfer their reading skills from their first language to English reading. And in some cases, they're actually doing better academically in dual language programming than in all English instruction. But the reality is that not every school district and every school within a district is positioned to provide that dual language option to parents. Until we get there, teachers in general education classrooms, who themselves may know only English, need effective strategies for supporting reading assessment and instruction for English learners. A brand new meta-analysis of instructional strategies on English learners' English reading comprehension by Zhu Teng Li and his colleagues can be very useful in this regard. Their analysis of 23 relevant studies found 4 strategies to be effective: scaffolding, graphic organizers, interactive read-alouds, and leveled questions. Each was effective on its own, but the combined usage of these 4 was additionally beneficial for improving English learners' reading comprehension. And by the way, this was true across the K-12 grades, from elementary to high school, and even ESL instruction at the university level. You will see in what follows that most of these strategies are indeed embedded within examples of formative assessment and oral discourse that I will share. First, I'll briefly introduce formative assessment, what it is, how it is particularly optimal for assessing culturally and linguistically diverse students, and how it can be valuable by itself, but also used to get students ready for large-scale summative assessments. In part, the definition of formative assessment prepared by CCSSO's State Collaborative reads, formative assessment is a planned ongoing process used by all students and teachers during learning and teaching to elicit and use evidence of student learning, to improve student understanding of intended disciplinary learning outcomes and support students to become self-directed learners. So in the context of reading, engaging in formative assessment means teachers and students monitor students' reading development. Teachers help children develop their reading skills by providing meaningful feedback for learning and instruction through formative assessment practices. These practices might include moment-to-moment proximal assessment for learning, such as noticing how well a student is sounding out an unfamiliar word in a decodable text as they're reading to their teacher, as well as pre-planned assessments, such as assigning a reading journal and using student responses to structure a follow-up discussion to support students' skill development, such as identifying facts and making inferences from the text. Both kinds of formative assessment practices are effective if accompanied by a learning progression that can function as an interpretive framework to guide next steps instruction. First, teachers need to know where students are in their progression towards reading proficiency so that they can more accurately target their instructional next steps. Just as an example, here's an excerpt from a learning progression focusing on text-level skills that describes students' skill development in terms of shifting from the rudimentary to the more sophisticated. So once teachers and students can establish with evidence from formative tasks and observation that students are using knowledge from their own experience to make sense of talk and about text, they can move on to supporting the use of grammar and graphophonic knowledge to predict and check the meaning of unfamiliar words. And eventually, once they've gathered evidence of these skills, they can focus on supporting abilities to recognize, for example, how logical relations are built through text connectives to compare, contrast, sequence, and indicate cause and effect, for example. There are several reasons that formative assessment is particularly effective and equitable with culturally and linguistically diverse students. Formative assessment produces multiple data points, which is important so students get an opportunity to clarify their responses. Formative assessment provides multiple kinds of evidence of student learning that can be gathered through samples of students' spoken responses. This could be students translanguaging, using their first language, and using all their linguistic resources when they're supported in the classroom. And then through student writing and even non-verbally, building representations, models, drawings, and so on. Formative assessment actually offers an excellent opportunity for divergent assessment. So in contrast with convergent assessment, which has a predetermined correct answer and judges whether or not a student's response aligns with that answer, the divergent assessment employs open-ended questions. It involves the creation of tasks involving the teacher working to gain insights into the full range of student reasoning and provides understanding of how students build conceptual knowledge and language, revealing any misconceptions along the way. Divergent assessment is suited to EL students whose responses may be less aligned with a predetermined correct answer due to the diversity in their background knowledge and the myriad of cultural and language experiences that they bring with them to the classroom. And continuing, formative assessment is not based on scores, but it's tailored feedback to both the learner and the teacher on ways to progress or move learning forward. Formative assessment supports student agency in the form of both peer and self-assessment, so students can be autonomous learners of language and new literacy throughout the day, not just waiting for moments when teachers intervene with instruction. And the immediate feedback that formative assessment can provide is found to be most effective with students with less background knowledge and lower academic performance profiles. And perhaps most importantly, formative assessment practices are an example of anti-deficit qualitative approaches to assessment with emergent bilingual students that are strengths-based, culturally aware and mindful, and seek to motivate students to accomplish ambitious, albeit differentiated goals, something that Noster and Meshulam in 2020 have called honest assessment. Formative assessment can be an end in itself, of course. And even before the pandemic, and certainly since, many are questioning the utility of summative assessments and raising concerns with racial equality and equity in large-scale assessment programs. However, while large-scale assessments are still with us, as alluded to earlier in the presentation, teachers can assist in preparing culturally and linguistically diverse students for such assessments through formative assessment opportunities at the classroom level. As my colleagues and I have argued for learning in other content areas, in order to improve students' summative assessment performances and enhance student academic successes more generally, we advocate for a wide variety of experiences that allow students to practice how to re-present, including orally, what they know in different contexts that have different demands on their language skill sets. And these can be planned as part of reading assessment and instruction. So that focus on oral language as a tool, as a rehearsal for conveying the knowledge that students will also need to convey in large-scale summative assessment situations, is key to this approach. By working closely with a team of teachers this past year, virtually, I've come to understand formative assessment as a process of creating spaces, openings, if you will, to invite students with the appropriate supports to tell us what they can know and can do, whatever the discipline. This work is being conducted as part of 2 National Professional Development Grants from the Office of English Language Acquisition in the US Department of Education. And we're working with educators in Connecticut. This particular strand of the Excel project has 2 main goals: to improve the instruction of students acquiring English as a new language, and increasingly to use a community of practice approach, to grow teachers' familiarity with and adoption of formative assessment practices, with each member of the community bringing their own experiences and expertise to develop everyone's understanding. There you see some of us in the Zoom sessions that we've had, and the pandemic provided a new norm for us to be able to work long distance, with some of us on the East Coast and some of us on the West Coast. We've brought different artifacts to our community of practice. On the educator side, these have been videos of classroom interaction, lesson plans, and student work. And on the researcher side, concepts and coding schemas. And together, we have looked at a couple of different problems of practice and come up with different strategies to tackle them. But I'm sharing one that uses what we call facilitative discourse moves to create those spaces for formative assessment to occur when working with culturally and linguistically diverse students. These are oral, communicative strategies that a teacher can consciously insert into instruction to elicit evidence of student learning, evidence that they can then peg to a learning progression like the one I showed earlier, and use it to know how best to next instruct their students. The work is based on discourse analysis of classroom video with my colleagues Carolyn Mayer, Louise Wilkinson, and Yusuf Nakajo, that took as its cue from research-based practices. And I put a link actually with the project website in the resource materials folder for the presentation, so you can access this information. But as my colleagues and I were developing these moves, we were keeping in mind all the time what we knew about formative assessment with culturally and linguistically diverse students, the kinds of things I was sharing earlier about the strengths of formative assessment. Then the teachers in our community of practice, they had an opportunity to read this work about a year ago and wanted to implement it in their own classrooms, both remotely and in person. And our community of practice, we began with the original 9 moves that came out of the work with math lessons. And then together we've adapted them for use in English language arts lessons as well, and added at least one new one so far. And that is eliciting connections. That's connecting the lesson content to children's own experiences or their home lives, and having students connect prior knowledge to current learning to display their new understanding. So for example, questions like the narrator, does anyone want to share a time when they felt let down? And a couple of other examples I wanted to share with you, inviting multiple solution strategies, which is often having the goal of making diverse solutions available for public consideration, or including multiple students in the discussion. And a reading comprehension example would be, what do you know about the main character's motives? And another one, justification questions, which would elicit how students are convinced that their responses or answers are correct. And an example in the reading comprehension context is, would you rather read the book than watch a movie? Why? Here's an example of the kinds of feedback from the community of practice that we gave to one another. In this case, to Heather, who was videoing asynchronous lessons in an interactive, communicative way. She still was giving her students opportunities in response to respond in ways that would help reveal to them if they had a grasp on the content or not, which we all thought was pretty amazing, that she could do this in such a teaching environment. And we coupled this then with a simple visual assessment, a self-assessment for the students, so that Heather could check in with students afterwards, engage how they were doing, how their learning was progressing. So now you have a chance to see this being done in a 5th grade context, where Katie videoed one of her lessons, and then we provided feedback on the moves to her to consider in her next lesson. Here she is about to do a read aloud of All My Stripes by Shana Rudolph and Danielle Roya. And I know this is a crash course on facilitated discourse moves for formative assessment, but maybe you can spot the spaces that Katie creates to formatively assess, where in this instance the whole class is. And maybe you can also identify one or two of the moves we just went over in terms of what Katie is already incorporating in her instruction. So if we can play the first video clip, please.
Those poems that you guys were deeply thinking about yourselves. What do I like? What makes me happy? What do I worry about? So I was thinking to myself that after doing that poem, we were learning all different things about you guys that maybe we didn't know earlier in the year. Maybe you're more comfortable about sharing your feelings. And I wanted you guys to understand that, and if you notice on the back wall, my class did this activity already. We kind of related our I am poems to a zebra. What do you guys know about a zebra? What do you know, Brandon? He has different stripes. What else? Maya?
Black and white.
He's black and white. What else? It's like a horse. It is similar to a horse? They're all unique. Perfect. That's exactly what I was looking for. Right? Every single zebra is unique. Do any two zebras have the same exact stripes and same patterns? No. So, what does that mean about all of you guys? Was anybody's poem exactly the same? No. Because why? We're all different. What else?
We're all our own person.
You're your own person? Evic, you want to share? Very good. I heard that word unique. What does that word mean? Who can give me a synonym for unique? Rating. Different. What do you think? Stand out? I'll take it. Brandon?
Different in a good way.
Different in a good way. Evic?
Different in our own way.
Different in your own way. So I want to share with you guys this story about this little zebra. His name happens to be Zane.
Well, I hope you noticed how much Katie invites her students to keep going, to reveal the extent of their understanding of just that one word, unique, and how she connects it to students' own prior work on a poem and also their personal experiences before she begins the read aloud. Another opportunity to support students comes through providing feedback before the lesson by annotating each other's lesson plans. So a pre-planning moment for formative assessment and noticing which moves might be helpful if time and the dynamics of the class allow for it. In this example of a 5th grade English language arts lesson plan, based on the reading Island of Blue Dolphins by Scott Odell, we noticed that the focus on evocative imagery that would give Katie a chance to have the students brainstorm a lot of different vocabulary, and that she could turn that into a planned formative assessment by having students place their words onto a continuum of evocativeness. I personally love this activity for lots of reasons, but in part because it gives the students a chance to hear each other's voices and ideas and learn new words from one another and not just from the teacher. And kids then have to negotiate where their word would fall on the evocativeness continuum. And you can see this same reading response activity in action in an upcoming set of modules provided by the California Department of Education for their new free resource, Improving Education of Multilingual and English Learner Students, Research to Practice. And I invite you to take a look at the extended vignettes in Chapter 5, prepared by Mary Schleppergel and myself. These vignettes show formative instruction embedded in several lessons. So we're going to the close of the presentation now, and I want to say that formative assessment, particularly practices which support culturally and linguistically diverse students, they make audible what students know, whether it's reading comprehension or other content areas, and it has all the properties and potential to make equitable assessment be baked in. So, and that's due to the ways it can, if done intentionally, make assessment accessible to all learners. So the final substantive word goes to another member of our community of practice, Dale, who is sharing more on that process of taking up or not the facilitated discourse moves that we had suggested for the 5th grade lesson plan. So can we please play the second video clip now?
No, I think that she went into, and I know that I did this too with my lesson, when you go in and just take a look at what you can add to a lesson through the discourse moves, you could, I think, and I had this conversation with Katie too, you could add all of the discourse moves to help, but it's probably in the best interest and best practice to pick some that you think are really going to resonate with the lesson plan. So when she really went through, we said, oh, we can do this one here and we can do this one here. But I think, putting suggestions and possible ones are great. You won't use that in every lesson. And in reality, in everyday situations as a teacher, I think, Sandy, you said this before too, you adjust your lesson as you're going. And sometimes you might see that this one that you're thinking about is going to work here, but it might not work there. So she really went through and put in a lot of suggestions, but she may only wind up using 2 or 3 of those. Or, it may be when she pulls the students in a small group to discuss it that she uses additional discourse moves and whatnot, especially if she has that L student in her group with her. So these suggestions are great, and I put them into a lesson that I made too. And, as teachers, we know that needs to be adjusted and changed all the time.
As mentioned, there's a resource slide in the resource folder for the conference where you can access the full community of practice video, as well as other links to materials that I'm hoping you'll find useful on formative assessment. And once you've created these spaces to reveal students' comprehension, I hope that you, like another member of our community of practice has said, will also start to see them pretty much everywhere. So thank you for listening.
Hi, Alison. Thank you so much. That was extremely interesting and actually inspiring to see some of that and hear from some of the practitioners actually doing that work. And for me, it raised a couple of questions. I suppose my main question, or one of my main questions, is what would you call some of the main lessons learned about fostering this kind of community of practice to support teachers of English learners?
Yeah, thanks, Hilary, and thank you for the warm introduction earlier.
Oh, yeah.
And hello to everybody who's online right now. I think we learned a lot by doing this project, and but more specifically, what have we learned about using community of practices as an approach? And I think one thing is, we could have decided just to have a prescribed way to roll out these facilitative discourse moves in this instance, and just given teachers that information and told them, do this and see how it goes. But I don't think we would have had anywhere near the uptake and the desire to use the different moves and to implement the different moves if we hadn't gone through a community of practice approach. I think, you heard our teachers, once we started to look at English language arts lessons, we had to add a new move. We kind of adapted things, and teachers really are able then to make this approach their own. And I think we would not have had that success. The other thing, about the community of practice approach, and as I think Maria has put into the chat a link to we're calling the design studios. Mm-hmm. The community of practice approach really lent itself, sort of dropped into that model of teachers leading teachers, and the Excel project had that already as its own practice. So mm-hmm. under the direction of Rini Avery and Jason Savone, who are the directors of the project, they have this practice of teachers sharing what they learn. And so having our small community of practice be able to disseminate to a much wider group on the network, on the Excel network, through the design studio approach as well. Mm-hmm. So really, what has worked for individual teachers then can get shared to a much wider group.
Right.
So we almost kind of, because of COVID, we serendipitously were actually recording our meetings, and we've been able, as I did today, take snippets from our activities in the community of practice and share those through this design studio model that was already in place. And then I should say, what I learned myself, I did mention in the prepared remarks that this idea of coming to understand formative assessment as spaces to sort of have this opportunity to foster student dialogue back and forth with one another, between student and teacher. It really speaks, I think, what I learned was the reciprocal nature of formative assessment and oral language. These dialogues that are happening. So the formative assessment really, it gives that opportunity. It needs children to converse. Sometimes we can get an understanding of children's learning non-verbally, as I mentioned, or through their writing. But a good amount of it is dialogue and talking and conversation in the classroom. And a formative assessment sort of creates that. It creates an additional opportunity for language and literacy learning. And at the same time, then it provides the evidence and generates the information that teachers need to act on for formative assessment. So it's really, they reinforce each other. So but I didn't really have a good appreciation or understanding of how critical that reciprocal relationship was until we started to do the community of practice work together.
Thank you. That sounds great, and I love the importance of teachers actually moving this forward and contributing to the design and the sort of iterative nature of this.
Yeah, it was very iterative. Yes, that's a word to use.
All the best processes are. And someone actually has submitted a question for someone who would like to start or develop a formative assessment. What would you recommend as a good starting point? I feel you've sort of implied some starting points, but.
Yeah, no, I should say, I mean, this in this particular instance, we didn't start out with the facilitative discourse moves, right? We had actually sort of made the ground a very fertile place to work by couple of years in the life of the project. We've been talking about formative assessment. We have had summer institutes on the topic of formative assessment, and we, learning progressions, which really support, they are this interpretive framework for if you're going to be taking a formative assessment approach to understanding children's reading development. So all those pieces were kind of in play. And I think I did mention in the prepared remarks that the teachers had picked up and read this additional paper, which had been part of that ongoing process. So really starting with a solid understanding and base for what formative assessment is, how you generate the information that you would need to be able to conduct, contingent teaching with students once you've got that information about where they are on a progression. So that takes time to build up. And then the implementation piece here with the facilitative discourse moves, that's really, about building things into a routine. There's other ways to conduct formative assessment. You could do observations in the classroom of what kids are doing, and you could collect information from your students. It could have students self-assess. As I mentioned, we created a sort of a little augmentation there for student self-assessment during the pandemic when they were working remotely. So there's lots of different ways. And what I've shared today is kind of just one inroad you could have to sort of be thinking about setting up the conditions for generating formative information with your students. And so we do have a lot of resources we can share for people who concretely want to pursue this and want to reach out to us afterwards. Absolutely. But just as a sort of it is, it's a challenge. It takes time to build up the background and the routine. So it's definitely an investment. But I would love if the person wants to reach out to us to be able to follow up.
Thank you. That's great. So you just referred to the challenge of building something this up. Are there any other challenges that you want to discuss? For example, what would you call the biggest challenge or the most difficult aspect of,
using a formative assessment approach to supporting students in their language and literacy development for teachers.
Yeah. I think Dale really speaks to this in the little clip that you saw. And that was this idea of you don't have to do everything. It starts small. Some of our prior work in California, we had had a similar sort of community of practice approach. And one of the mantras we had was, just small pieces at a time. You're not going to have to memorize and implement all 10, for instance, of these facilitated discourse moves in this particular example. But, just take off a couple of things that you might be able to work into your lesson and not feel that pressure. The thing about formative assessment, it's not high stakes assessment. And so to know that, as a teacher, knowing that is, I think, you can relieve the anxiety of thinking, am I doing this right? Do I know everything I need to know about this particular approach? On the other hand, though, I would say it's not no stakes. So the way I've characterized it actually in the past and in the title of the book that you mentioned is it's day-to-day stakes. It's what you need to know on the basis of the information that gets generated at that moment when you're working with a student, and that you can then have some, actionable response to meet the student where they are at that moment to move their learning forward. So it does have stakes, and it is important, I think, to pre-plan. So that could be done through the lesson plan approach that we are trying out right now. And, sort of you can guess where you might be able to work in some formative assessment, and where you might be able to make that more, open that space for it to happen with the formative, the facilitative discourse moves. But on the other hand, things will happen and it won't happen. It won't go to plan. But I think you need to sort of have good enough knowledge and confidence with these different moves so that you can work them into the lesson as it may happen just in the moment. So I think it's that combination that's a challenge, to sort of plan for it, but have the flexibility that if it doesn't work out, that's okay, and if it doesn't come up in class, that's okay as well. But to have enough knowledge and familiarity with the moves that you can work them in then on the fly, and because you never know what's going to come up in the lesson. So that's it's kind of that combination can be a challenge. But again, having a routine, and then of course the other thing is having the support of colleagues. I should have said that as a lesson learned about community of practices. Is you have colleagues. So very, having that group to go back to bring, bring lesson plans to, work through with your colleagues is really, that's an incredible strength of that particular approach.
That's great. I feel like you've addressed in what you've been saying quite thoroughly, and also in your talk, the ways in which you're working as a researcher with practitioners really does come together to facilitate student learning. Is there anything else you want to add about that?
I'm a language researcher, and so that's kind of where my laser focus is on whenever we get some lesson plan to look at or some classroom video to look at. But the partnership that we have with the teachers, everyone's bringing their own different expertise and the different lenses that they have on this, and so collectively it's a really great strength. We've had these sustained conversations over a year now, so that's a major characteristic of our team and how we work together. I mentioned we have different sort of problems of practice and that we'd like to tackle, so very sort of concrete things that we're looking at, very driven with all on the same page with the same goals of trying to both support teachers to then support their English language learners. And so, I think we all bring some different aspects to this partnership. one thing we would love to do actually moving forward is to do a more systematic documentation of this process. The proof is in the pudding, right? If students are making progress and teachers can see that with their day-to-day stakes formative assessment, that's very reinforcing. But I think we need to be able to document this, investigate more, look at the efficacy, both in terms of teacher learning as well as student learning, and and be able to then disseminate those findings as well. So having that partnership has been really important, and to continue that in that endeavor as well.
Yeah, I'm sure that documentation would be incredibly helpful to people, both on the research and the practitioner side, obviously.
Yeah.
I think we are out of time. I want to thank you for this great session, and thank you everyone who attended. There were a lot of appreciative comments. Excuse me for the rooster sound in the background.
Thank you, Hillary, and thank you everyone for being here today. Thanks.
And I hope everyone enjoys the rest of the conference.
Bye.
Bye.